After a grueling 8 months, leading the Navy's effort to counter Iran-backed Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, the aircraft carrier Dwight D. Eisenhower received a reprieve this month when it transited the Suez Canal and headed into the Mediterranean Sea on its way back home to Norfolk. During more than 200 days of taking down a barrage of Houthi drones and missiles, the Ike became the latest East Coast-based carrier to see its deployment extended multiple times. Dating back to 2021, carriers Harry S. Truman, George H.W. Bush, and most recently Gerald R. Ford also encountered extended periods underway to fulfill American naval presence requirements. Together, these carriers spent roughly 9 months at sea, up from the standard 7-month deployment schedule. While the Ike is wrapping up its deployment, another East Coast carrier isn't ready to replace it in the region, prompting an already deployed West Coast carrier to replace it. Ike's latest extended cruise and its replacement once again raise questions about the finite carrier fleet's ability to respond to a seemingly relentless series of global events requiring a flat-ops unique American naval presence. Ultimately, the requirements levied on the carriers by the Navy and combatant commanders are greater than what the 11-carrier fleet can meet, according to Bradley Martin, the director of the RAND Corporation's National Security Supply Chain Institute. There just aren't enough ships to go around, Martin told Navy Times. Now that's not necessarily strictly a carrier problem. It's also a destroyer or amphibious assault ship problem. But it's a problem of size. It's a problem of capacity. As Ike left the theater, and a Houthi battle that officials say is the Navy's most kinetic since World War II, the Pentagon announced that the San Diego-based carrier Theodore Roosevelt would steam into the Middle East from Asia-Pacific to replace its presence. It will be the first time a non-East Coast carrier has operated in the Middle East since the Japan-based Ronald Reagan headed there in 2021 to oversee the American pullout from Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Martin said he suspects that such extended deployments will become the norm, given the need for carrier presence in the Middle East, the Pacific, and Europe as the Ukraine war rages on. Carriers like the Truman, Bush, and Ford faced roughly 9 months at sea during their respective deployments in recent years, up from the standard 7-month deployment schedule. Out on the West Coast, the carrier Nimitz underwent a roughly 11-month deployment that spanned most of 2020 and the first part of 2021. As long as combatant commanders want to have these ships on a fairly constant basis, these types of situations are going to come up, Martin said. Experts say the taxed carrier fleet comes from a mix of too few ships and global events that are beyond the control of anyone in Washington. Events like the Israel-Hamas war have unexpectedly placed an additional strain on the fleet, especially for ships based on the East Coast. The composition of the carrier fleet allows the Navy to deploy a carrier in the Indo-Pacific, but not in both the Middle East and European theaters simultaneously, where the Iran-Hamas and Russian threats linger, respectively, according to Brian McGrath, a former destroyer captain and head of the Ferrybridge Group defense consulting firm. Before the ongoing Hamas-Israel war, the East Coast carrier Ford was operating in the Mediterranean Sea, serving a deterrence role against Russia, as carriers have since the outbreak of the Ukraine war in early 2022. However, after that, Ford and then Ike's focus turned toward Israel and the Middle East. "We are a nation that has a need for 3 carriers out and about all the time," McGrath said. "And we are a nation that possesses essentially enough to do 2 at a time. The bottom line is that these assets are tremendously in demand because nothing says you care more than an aircraft carrier. This just so seriously undercuts the case of the people who talk about the aircraft carrier being obsolete, and it's not," McGrath added. This capacity issue would be exacerbated in the event of multiple global crises, experts warn. Countering multiple threats across the globe was the focus of the Navy and Marine Corps' large-scale exercise in 2023, testing the service's ability to globally synchronize operations to defeat several threats in different geographic regions at the same time. However, the Navy has not made the results of that exercise public. Outside of exercises, experts agree the Navy would encounter difficulties juggling simultaneous conflicts in various geographic areas. The current fleet, Martin said, is not sufficient to meet multiple crises at once without taking some extraordinary measures. Ships, including carriers, would face extended deployments and maintenance delays, an arrangement that would be difficult to sustain for an extended period. While the Navy likely won't build any more aircraft carriers beyond what's already scheduled, given technological advancements and the fact that multiple Ford-class carriers are still years away, Martin said the service could reevaluate its force structure and identify ways to meet requirements that carriers provide through alternative means. Ultimately, it's going to take more of something in order to meet what I think are bona fide national needs, Martin said. The Navy's new long-range shipbuilding plan, released in March, calls for an inventory of 11 or 12 aircraft carriers over the course of the next decade. Overall, the proposal sets a goal of 381 ships by the year 2042, up from the previous target of 373 ships by that time. Still, accomplishing these numbers are dependent on the industry eliminating lengthy backlogs and cost overruns, coupled with consistent congressional funding. McGrath said, pouring more funding into a bigger fleet could mitigate some of today's challenges. Money doesn't solve everything, but it solves an awful lot of things. And right now we are spending woefully less money than we need to, McGrath said. Experts attribute part of this strain to East Coast carriers having to shoulder more geopolitical hotspots than their brethren elsewhere. Currently, the West Coast hosts the aircraft carriers Carl Vinson, Abraham Lincoln, Nimitz, and Theodore Roosevelt. The carrier George Washington is completing a deployment to South America this summer as it moves from the East Coast to Japan after wrapping up an extended and oft-delayed midlife refueling and complex overhaul, or RCOH, in Virginia. GW will replace Ronald Reagan, which will leave Japan and undergo maintenance at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, Washington. The carriers like Ike, Truman, Bush, Ford, George H.W. Bush, and Stennis call the East Coast home. Unlike the West Coast carrier fleet, nearly all those East Coast carriers are unavailable to deploy due to various maintenance needs. Stennis will be out of the picture for some time as it undergoes its midlife overhaul. Bush returned home from its extended deployment last year and entered maintenance in December, and Ford got home from its extended cruise in January and is expected to undergo roughly a year of work before it can go again. That leaves Truman as the next East Coast carrier. It wrapped up a maintenance period in December, and the Navy initially said it would deploy in early 2024, which would have seen it eventually replacing Ike in the Middle East. But that didn't happen, and officials now say Truman likely won't deploy until later this year, following its pre-deployment composite training unit exercise this summer. While West Coast carriers are largely focusing on Indo-Pacific deployments, East Coast carriers are having to navigate cruises in Europe and the Middle East. The East Coast is under pressure, McGrath said. While the carrier deployment schedule is designed to accommodate the extensions facing East Coast carriers, the main consequence of these lengthy deployments is the maintenance the carriers must undergo once they return, said Brian Clark, a retired submarine officer and director of the Hudson Institute think tank's Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. In addition to throwing the maintenance schedule out of whack, extended deployments wear down the aging carriers faster, increasing the likelihood of new breakdowns accumulating, which presents additional challenges when those carriers go into the yards, Clark said. For instance, the Eisenhower, the second oldest carrier in the fleet, commissioned in 1977, underwent 15 months of maintenance after it returned from a double-pump deployment in 2021. Following the recent cruise, Ike would almost certainly face another lengthy period in the yard. On the brighter side, however, the Pentagon officials argue that the mission performed by Ike and its strike group was critical to keeping the region from exploding since the Hamas-Israel war. They say a significant U.S. naval commitment to the region sends a strong signal to the commercial shipping industry that vessels can get protection as they travel the crucial transit route through the Red Sea, from the Suez Canal to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. About 12% of the world's trade typically passes through the waterway that separates Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, including oil, natural gas, grain, and everything from toys to electronics. The Houthis have attacked ships since November, saying they want to force Israel to end its offensive in the Gaza Strip against Hamas. The Houthis have also fired missiles toward Israel, though they have largely fallen short or been intercepted. Ike and its strike group, including the cruiser Philippine Sea and the destroyers Gravely and Mason, also have participated in 5 major joint missions with British forces to target dozens of the militant group's drones, missile launchers, and other facilities and targets in Yemen. All told, Ike's air wing has flown more than 12,100 sorties, totaling over 27,200 flight hours, and the strike group has launched more than 350 air-to-surface weapons and more than 50 air-to-air missiles. The warships have each traveled more than 55,000 miles, and they've launched more than 100 Standard and Tomahawk missiles. In all, the strike group has gone after about 430 either pre-planned or dynamic targets in its mission to defend U.S. coalition and merchant ships in the Red Sea.